And welcome back to Royally Resilient. We are in episode 8. Today we'll be talking about control. I have with me today Beth Ferguson, our school psychologist, Mallory Wassman, our elementary social worker, and Tara Neidig, our secondary social worker at the middle and high schools. And I'm Jessica Sontag. We have been moving through this book, Building Resilience in Children and Teens by Dr. Ginsberg. Dr. Ginsberg talks about the 7 C's of resilience, and this week we are on control, which is the final C in that series. And I think it's really important. He says here in the first part, you guys, when I discuss control in the context of building children's resilience, I mean they're controlling their actions and therefore their outcomes. And I think that's important to just note because last week we were talking about coping, and oftentimes when we think about control, it's thought of as a coping mechanism. So here in this section of the book, he's really focusing on how do we give kids more control so that they can develop resiliency. So the first thing that he talks about, what is really important, is that helping children understand that things don't just happen to them, that they can be decision makers and problem solvers who really control their outcomes. And they learn that through delayed gratification, which we talked about earlier in this series, which helps them really reach those long-term goals. And some of what we do as parents really makes a path for how much control our kids, or in our school setting, how much control our students are able to take on and therefore impact their outcomes by the way that we parent or lead within our classroom. So he talks about authoritarian, permissive, disengaged, and authoritative parenting styles. So did you guys have any thoughts on those different styles that you want to just hit on?
I mean, he definitely kind of highlights that you want to aim almost for that authoritative kind of style in the way that he talks about each one. But I thought it was interesting. Just I find like there's little pieces of me as I'm becoming a parent that kind of could fit under all of them. And so as I was kind of thinking about each style, kind of which one I guess do I lean the most toward, or what is my goal? What kind of parenting style do I want to have or embrace?
Yeah.
Kind of go into a little bit about what he talks about, or
Sure.
Well, can I just say, I think you made a really important point that needs to be underscored, and that is as you think about your parenting style, because sometimes we may approach it like it's happening to us, and oh, look, this is how I reacted to a situation. But I think one of the things that he makes really clear is that we should reflect on and think about the parenting that we had, what our parent styles were like, not from a I need therapy and fix it, but that informs what might be your go-to style. And if you want and can begin to think about it and make some small adjustments that might move you into a direction that you'd rather go, it really adds to the proactive part of the control piece, and not just, well, I'm I forgot what it's called now, and I don't have the book in front of me. Authoritative, right? Authoritative, because that's how I was parented, or permissive because that's how I was parented. So,
yeah, I think it's important to go back a minute and just say authoritarian when he talks about that. That's kind of that attitude of do what I say just because I said so. I'm the boss in this house, and if you live here, you live by my rules, kind of thing. And permissive is really like, I'm going to teach you our values. I'm going to give you support. I'm going to love you no matter what. I trust you. And so therefore, I'm not setting any boundaries for you. I trust that you'll set your own boundaries because of how we have, taught you your sense of right and wrong. Disengaged is really like when we're too busy or otherwise occupied to really monitor our child or set those limits in a close way. It's kind of a do whatever you want, laissez-faire type attitude. And it's inconsistent and it sends our kids mixed messages at times because when they do whatever they want and it's not really what we want them to do, then we have to have that conversation, right? And then authoritative is the parent that sets reasonable limits, expects good behavior, offers love and encouragement. But when it comes to big issues, important issues like wearing a seatbelt or wearing a helmet on your bike, it's do what I say because it's for your safety. Um, and he just says that children raised with authoritarian, remember that, do as I say because I'm the boss, parents, they do heed the line to a certain point, but then they get to that rebellion part, right? Because they've never had any control over what's happening to them. Children raised with permissive parents know that they're loved, but they crave boundaries so much, and they really act out of consciousness or guilt versus a sense of control again of who they are. So again, it's not to make us think like, oh, I'm that kind of parent or I have screwed up because I have done more of this. It's just more about it's really easy to be really this is it and it's my way or the highway, or it's really easy to say you got this, go on your own. But what we know they need are these boundaries. We need to create those for them to feel safe.
And I agree with Mallory. When I look through those 4, I feel like I've done those things, but when I've been more the authoritarian, it's because of safety or their health, where I've said, you are not doing that. It's because of their safety and their health. And so I feel like I feel like we all do it at different times with certain things. Like you said, Jessica, with the big issues, it's a yes or no, it's black and white. And with the other things, it can be a little gray. You can give them a little more leeway and make those decisions. But if every time, and he talks about it later, if every time you make those decisions for them, then they don't know what to do.
Right? We've robbed them of the chance, right, to become problem
we don't
solvers.
give them the chance to, mess up.
Right. And I think that's such an important thread, he talks throughout this whole book, and we've talked about it if you've been with us week to week, of get out of the way, right? Like if our kids are going to be competent and they're going to be resilient and they're going to be problem solvers, we have to give them opportunities to fail, to solve the problems, to try these things in a really low risk situation while they're still children, while they know that we love them unconditionally, like all these things, they're still safe and protected. But we do have to provide them those buffers, the walls, if you will, right?
And he kind of talks about that later on, and I'm kind of jumping ahead. But he talked about it in an analogy of when you're doing a puzzle. And I loved that. I loved the way that I was able to really visualize that when you're doing a puzzle, you start out with the corners, you start out with the edges, and you build that outside parameter because it's easy to see. It's, they're easy to identify, I guess I should say. Mm-hmm. And he says that that's kind of what our role is as parents, is to create those borders. And Beth, I know you and I were kind of talking a little bit about it, like one of your colleagues or one of your friends said, it's like a fence, yeah. And it is. It's creating that outside boundary and that border, but then allowing them to fill in the middle parts. And those parts are hard. Mm-hmm. And we're going to need the outside to be able to complete their puzzle. And I liked too, when we were talking, like I said, Beth, when you said it kind of goes along with the developmental stage too, like where those borders and where those boundaries are. So yeah, I don't know, that was a really good analogy that he used.
Yeah, shout out to Ruth Kidd, speech and language pathologist from Bellevue, Washington. When I was very young, we worked closely together when I was very young. When I didn't have before I had kids. And she would say frequently, kids need fences. They need those boundaries, and they need to sometimes, if a fence gets broken, they need to be part of help, repairing it. And it was just a great analogy for thinking about parenting and the role that we have. That it's less about building the road and the vehicle that they're going on, but instead creating some safety around them. And when you're able to, expanding those a little bit and letting them build some gates or whatever. I don't want to overdo the fence analogy, but
but safety and space, both of those.
Yeah.
Giving safety and the space to do it.
And also having to mend it at times, that kind of brings us into that idea of natural consequences, right? So through part of this parenting and giving our kids more control and increasing the amount of control they have, they are going to make decisions. And then there will be consequences to those decisions. And thinking about our role as parents is to teach our kids. And that's really the true meaning of that discipline word that we all know. Not to punish, but to teach them. And the best way to do that at times is typically through the natural consequences. Their choice resulted in this consequence. And then they have to live within that. And as we talked about several weeks ago with the competency C, oftentimes as parents, we want to save our kids from even some of those natural consequences, because we know that those consequences are going to end in disappointment at times. And really the most important thing we can do is just let the consequences fall the way that they will, and let our kids learn that they're still going to be okay, and they're going to move on, and they'll make a different decision next time, right? But if we save them, they might not make a different decision next time.
Yeah, learning to sit with that discomfort.
Yeah, for sure.
Am I muted? I'm really struggling with whether I'm muted or not. So sorry if I,
we can hear you.
I struggle. I think there's a reason he put control at the end, because I don't think that people that give away a lot of control necessarily are as interested in this book. But those of us who like to have some control, if this was the first chapter, we would get so hung up in here that we couldn't see the rest of them. So I like the timing for this. After you see the importance of all the other pieces that are really, the way he presents them, child-centered, this chapter really integrates, he starts right out saying kids need to learn and develop that control. But he also talks about us needing to be very aware of where we need that control and how we need to sort of be aware of when we need to loosen and when we need to, hold tighter. So,
right.
As a recovering control freak, I'm not sure how recovering, but this is a harder chapter really to digest, because I feel a bit indicted sometimes in looking at it, especially since my kids are already grown and out of the house, but I wish I'd had this when they were younger.
One of the things I know that we talked about as we were going through this chapter was those things that we do to help increase our children's control, right? And again, I think this could, if you're listening from an educator perspective or a parent perspective, I think this is a useful tool. We talked about advanced planning, family meetings. Those could be class meetings. And really within all of that, he talks about making sure we are focusing on listening to our kids in order to keep them talking. What thoughts or pieces jumped out at you when we were talking about these types of things?
This was probably my favorite part of this section of control. I liked that giving children the opportunity to know what to expect. And I felt like when he was talking about the advanced planning, really what he's saying is keep them in the know of what that consequence will be if they continue a behavior that isn't acceptable in your household. And I loved that. I loved the fact that it gives and for them to be a part of that conversation or a part of maybe even creating or choosing what that consequence would look like. So it feels again less like it's a do what I told you because I told you to, and more of a because we're a family or because we are a class, and what we do and say impacts how other people think and feel. And so to me, it aligned really well with what I do in my profession, obviously, but also I loved that, so many times I think what helps us feel more in control is when we know what's coming.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that was a really good fit. And I loved the idea of a family meeting. And I also like that he talked about a family meeting not just being about something major or massive or because of something bad that happened. It can be any decision. What color are we going to paint the dining room, or what are we having for dinner this week, what are our meal plans going to look like this week. It can be just any time that you're sitting around and you're listening to each other, you're practicing that skill, and you're able to create those conversations to keep kids talking. Then when something does happen that sucks, you can still have that, it's time for a family meeting because this is what we do. And it's not considered another punishment or consequence to it. It's seen as like, this is just how we solve problems here. So I love those two little sections.
And
the thing.
Well, I was just going to say, it does increase their control because, as you said, if you're talking about, these are the things, if I find out that you drive after drinking, or you drive with too many friends, you will lose the keys for X amount of days. They still are making the decision then. It's not that they came home and you found out afterwards and then you lay on the scaffolding consequences, right? Of you are not going to drive for a week. What? No, you're not going to drive for a month. No, keep telling. No, now it's you're not going to drive for a year, right? We all can at times be guilty of going through the wait. Consequences that are not natural. They don't fit the crime, so to speak, and take away our kids' ability to really understand that their behavior resulted in a consequence and knowing what that would be.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I say this a lot at work, and it goes with the stress topic when we talked about the, where you are on the stairs. When we try to provide consequence or figure out the consequence when we're in our downstairs brain or when the child is, that just can easily dissolve or devolve into a screaming match. But when I think about advanced planning, at least for our kids, I still talk a lot with them about finding teachable moments. So whether it was a television show we were watching or a story that they were telling about something that a friend of theirs did or that they heard about, we would try to wrap those conversations into what would you do in that situation? Mm-hmm. And that would also go with, let me tell you that right now, as you tell this to me, the parent in me is saying this, if you ever did this, this is how I would respond. And to be able to have that conversation when it's not them defending or feeling defensive about it, it takes a whole new, it makes a whole new dynamic with that. And I do feel like because we thought about teachable moments and times to have those conversations, that advanced planning happened almost more naturally.
Yeah.
because I'm telling you, I thought I'm one of these people that before I had kids, I probably had every contingency in my head about how I would respond if they did this, because that's just how I am. I make those stories in my head in order to somehow have some kind of fake control over it. And my kids taught me that they will never do the story I have in my head. They present me with a curveball that I can't have prepared for. But when their real life experiences lend to that conversation, it's way more effective. And I think it just ends up being, a great way of sort of helping them anticipate and make some of the decisions that they do.
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of talks about that, and kind of, Jessica, what you were speaking on that, with the downstairs brain piece of it. I mean, he calls it essentially a lose-lose situation, because you're either getting yourself into a situation where the child then loses sight of the consequence as being because of their own choice or their own action.
Yeah.
Instead, it's because you're saying it and you're so unfair, or it's mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or aunt and uncle, whoever it may be, versus they're looking internally on what they did and their own choice. So that's your first lose. Or your other lose is that you then realize that you went a little far, and it doesn't make sense for anyone in the family for you to lose your keys for an entire month or the summer or the year.
Right.
Yeah. So you then backpedal.
Yeah, that's where he talked about for adolescents. They have scenarios where your parenting is legitimate authority. I think he used that. Mm-hmm. Those are the things that they expect because they know that you're about their safety and their well-being, and that they bow to that. They know that boundary, and they know it comes from legitimate authority. But when you start to make decisions based on things that are more social or are more part of their social developmental world, that it delegitimizes that authority, and they no longer respond to it. We call it maybe disrespectful, that they're responding disrespectfully, but it's because you've stepped into an arena that in their mind you aren't. This isn't about my safety or well-being. Now you're being judgmental about my friend, and that's where we see the Romeo and Juliet kind of friendships carry on, because my parents stepped over a line, and this is not where they get to have authority in my life. And that was, I like the way he described that, because I had never really thought of it as,
I think they did, not he, but somebody did a research study on it. I think they pooled teenagers to this and said, what do you think parents should be able to
have control over? Basically. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tara, what do you think about the idea of not everything is within our control?
That's something that I talk a lot about with students at school and with my own kids, because there's so many things that we feel like when something happens, we feel like, oh, I'm just going to handle it. But there's some things that we don't get to choose, especially my middle school kids. Do you have control over that, or is that a decision mom and dad get to make? And if they can accept that, they can get to the point where they can accept that they don't have control over it, it's less stressful. And they can move on, or they can do things differently to avoid it or whatever. But that's a big thing. And with my kids, can you control that? You didn't like that assignment. You didn't like how that was graded. You didn't like, what do you do to fix it then? You can't change the teacher, so how do you deal with it?
Right. Yeah.
What a great tool.
He really talks about if we're going to get through the hard stuff, we need to obviously be resilient, but the only way we can do that is to know what we can and can't control, what's within our power, what's not. And if it is within our power and feels really overwhelming, we can move through that by taking it one step at a time. He actually uses the ladder analogy. So one rung at a time. Just take the first step. Then we can take more. So that's a way to gain control over things that are causing us to feel not so great. But sometimes there's just going to be things that happen that we have zero control over. Case in point, COVID-19, right? We have no control over the stay-at-home order. We have no control over how fast or slow this pandemic is going to move through our communities. But what we do have is control over how we feel about that, or our response to that, right? And so he says, to overcome any adversity, children must know when they have the power to change something and when they should reserve their energy. Think about anxiety. At some level, it results from the confusion about what we can and can't control. Like all emotions, anxiety can be helpful, but when it's out of control, it can be paralyzing. It's better to know what we can and can't control, even though we all seek the control. Sometimes it's just not within our realm.
Mm-hmm. And then it goes back to the coping then. What do you do?
That's right. That's right. And all of the C's.
Right.
Any final thoughts about control that you guys want to mention or share?
The only other thing that I thought was you highlighted, and I'm flipping through because I want to make sure I say it correctly, but it's along that same line of one step at a time. I think what he's ultimately trying to say is they need to be able to have control. You need to be able to have some sort of control. And what that's going to do is it's not that you're giving them full independence. The ultimate goal is that they're interdependent.
Right.
That they know where your boundaries are. They know where your fence ends and starts, and they know how to maybe go beyond that. And they also know how to get right back in and use you when they need it. And I think I like the way that he kind of focused on, if you ask a parent, I think he says, like, if you ask a parent if they want them to be your child to be fully independent, they'll be like, yeah. But it's not so much that you want them to be able to know that you're still there. You're still gonna support them. You're gonna help them with that resiliency. So I like that interdependence that he kind of highlighted.
Yeah, I think we talked about that a couple weeks ago. Of it's good for them to know that they can ask for help, and that it's healthy to ask for help, right? It's a give and take in a relationship. So awesome. Well, we are about to finish this book. So we have one more week to go, and that will be really talking. It's kind of a combination of a wrap up of where we've been, but also specific to teens and how, as a community, we can help our teens become more resilient. So we're going to be talking about that from a school community as well as a neighborhood, where we live, where we're growing up type community, next week. So we look forward to diving into that as well. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Bye.